Good evening. Tonight's special edition of Moving Pictures takes a turbulent ride through the 10-year history of the most adventurous film company to emerge in 80s Britain. Palace Pictures was founded by two likely lads, Steve Woolley, a cinema usher with a passion for movies, and Nik Powell, who organized Richard Branson's spreadsheets during the early years of the Virgin Empire. Woolley and Powell made 18 feature films together, including The Company of Wolves, Absolute Beginners, Mona Lisa, Scandal, and The Crying Game. Their choices were risky and highly individual. They had little interest in British traditions of tasteful costume drama, literary adaptations, quirky comedy, or documentary naturalism. A Palace picture was closer to the lush romanticism of Black Narcissus or The Red Shoes, but with pop rock soundtracks. It's no accident that of all the directors Woolley and Powell have cultivated, the most prominent is Neil Jordan, that quintessential modern romantic, creator of The Crying Game, one of the most successful films ever made by an independent company. But Palace did more than produce pictures. It also bought hundreds of films for distribution in the UK, both in the cinema and on video. Its distinctive logo adorned movies ranging from art house classics to cult gore, from Diva to Nightmare on Elm Street. Woolley and Powell were tireless hustlers, but their nose for a deal seldom overruled their eye for an offbeat movie. They seemed to have all the qualifications to be captains of the British film industry. And yet, in August of last year, Palace went spectacularly bankrupt, devastating its admirers and bringing some rather cold comfort to its detractors. How could things go so badly wrong? We decided to track Palace from its absolute beginnings to the arrival of wolves at the company door. Powell and Woolley talked candidly to Moving Pictures, and we also went in search of collaborators, interested observers, and of course, creditors. Together, they helped tell a story of British cinema in the 80s, which is also a story of Britain in the 80s.
I never took any money off any film I ever produced. Every fee I ever made went back into Palace. Palace was my life.
I had a complete turnaround with regards to how I thought of particularly Woolley, who I did think in the early days was a bit of a tap dancing spiv. But I actually think that their body of work was quite considerable.
What Palace should be remembered for was really, in a sense, the last British film company.
You could look at a film and say that's a Palace film, because it was kind of anarchic and kind of offbeat, and taken as a whole, the films that they made certainly were diverse.
I remember Nik in the pub in the George on Wardour Street saying to somebody, "Oh, I don't know why you want to run a good company, a big company well, when you can run a small company badly like me,
If you're going to sort of fly by the seat of your pants, I suppose eventually you'll crash.
There was a sickening irony in that Crying Game should happen too late. There were people who felt that we got our comeuppance, that we were a little brash, a little arrogant. I mean, these may be fair criticisms. It's difficult for me to judge.
The thing about old Woolley, at least he started off by standing at the back of a cinema in the dark as an usher, and loved film, truly loved film. He wasn't an accountant who suddenly found himself in a film company. He went into film because of film.
Palace's foundations lie in a long-lost cinema in central London, where the then 20-year-old Stephen Woolley programmed a mix of horror, cult movies, Hollywood classics, and foreign art films. Eclectic in the extreme, the Scala was also a late 70s punk venue for bands like the Slits. Woolley's skills impressed Nik Powell, one of the founders of the Virgin Empire, who was looking for a new direction as he split from Richard Branson.
When I left Virgin to set up Palace, obviously I had already had an enormous experience of a very wide variety of businesses, everything from retail to record companies to music publishing companies to blooming restaurants. I mean, Richard was already at that time into every conceivable business, at least vaguely related to the entertainment business.
He would sort out the mess that I would get the company into. So he'd come along behind me and sweep up the bits and try to sort things out.
I was looking for a partner, someone who combined creativity with business skills or an aptitude for business, and it was clear that Steve had both of those. He was able to take a almost bankrupt little cinema and make it into a profitable, vibrant, living, an important part of London's cinema life.
When the embryonic Channel 4 bought the site of the old Scala for its new headquarters in 1980, Steve Woolley found a new home for his cinema in London's King's Cross.
Nik Powell asked me at about the point, I think 81, 82, when we'd opened this theatre, if I'd be interested in starting a video label with him.
The motivation behind starting Palace, the video label, was they were constantly inundated with requests for films like Eraserhead and the Herzog films, etc., that just weren't available on video, that one could only see at late-night shows. I was brought in to replace the usherettes at the Scala, who Steve wasn't very happy with, selling videos in between shows.
It wasn't at all practical, carrying boxes and videos up and down 4 or 5 flights of stairs. But I think it was a very nice place to start, and it showed very much the type of video company that we were going to be.
Palace sold videos in their own shops in London and through mail order. The next step was to open movies in cinemas, primarily as a way of promoting their video release.
Steve very much was the driving force behind acquiring Evil Dead, which was our first major hit. And I always put it down to the fact that the director, Sam Raimi, who was even younger than Steve, 19 at the time, addressed him as Sir.
The Evil Dead.
The Evil Dead was launched simultaneously in cinemas and on video. Its release coincided with the media outcry about video nasties and gave Palace a crash course in how to turn press attention to its advantage.
This film had not been released anywhere in the world. Here was a very low-budget film, but here was a film that was going to be as shocking and as entertaining as Jaws.
Cheryl?
We did something with that gesture. We did the same thing with Diva. We said, this has got subtitles, but it's a great film. I mean, we promoted it in a way that didn't say French subtitle movie.
Palace's success with Diva, which made over £1 million in Britain alone, led them to go shopping at Cannes for other potential movies, which they could sell to the young, hip audience they were cultivating.
Cannes was like one of those competitions where you fit as many people as possible into a phone box. We used to hire, whereas everyone else would stay at the Majestic for £300 or £400 a night, we used to cram as many people as possible into the smallest possible flat. With Nik giving instructions never to buy anyone a drink at the Majestic bar, always to have drinks bought for you. The great Palace overhead.
Blow the hole if you like, lads, but leave me be.
You're making payments.
I was told to.
Tell us this some.
One movie found at Cannes was Angel, one of the first films commissioned by Channel 4. Woolley opened Angel at the Scala just as the channel went on air in November '82. Meeting up with Neil Jordan, the young Irish writer-director, led Palace into another area of the film business.
We decided that we would go into production, and I met with Neil after Angel, and I just said, what would you like to do in London? He wanted to do a story which in fact turned out to be The Crying Game. And I said, okay, great. It was also to star Stephen Ray. It was a kind of the flip side to Angel. And he then couldn't finish the script.
Originally called The Soldier's Wife, the script featured a relatively uncomplicated love story between an IRA member and the widow of a British soldier.
The problem with The Crying Game, the reason we didn't do it all those years ago, was because once I brought the story to London, it became a story of social realism. And I know there's a lot of people who can do that much better than I can. Simple as that, you know.
He then wanted to do a story by Angela Carter called The Company of Wolves.
For the earth shall be full.
I had an idea of how we could expand this into a kind of portmanteau film, you know, use a lot of Angela's other stories and make it a kind of a huge kind of fantasy movie. I sat down with Angela for about 3 or 4 weeks and we wrote the script. And people literally would look at this script, they would not know what it is, but Stephen had enough passion to basically kind of to terrify people into fear of refusal of this thing. Do you understand? Because people didn't know what it was.
Eventually, Jordan and Carter's very grown-up Little Red Riding Hood was financed to the tune of £2.5 million by Lou Grade's ITC. Shooting began on an elaborate set at Shepperton with experienced wolves and novice actors. It could hardly have been a more ambitious movie for a first-time producer.
Stephen's lack of experience, or the fact that he hadn't come up through the industry or through any old boys network, it made him far more imaginative and far more willing to take chances than other producers would have been.
Neil and I talked an awful lot about the horror genre. My influence over Neil was very much encouraging him to go for those images, and I think perhaps subconsciously there were things in the film that we'd seen elsewhere or that were in other movies that we'd maybe distributed.
And you look at Evil Dead, that kind of sensibility informed what Steve did when he produced The Company of Wolves with Neil, so that Stephen Ray tears his face off in Company of Wolves could easily have been a scene straight out of The Evil Dead.
Company of Wolves, they opened in the Odeon Leicester Square, and I don't think they'd ever done that with a British movie for years.
I remember David Puttnam calling me, who I didn't even know, was a total stranger to me, and ringing me saying, you know, that theatre is too big. It's crazy. You're going to have a big flop. And people kept saying that. Why are you in the Odeon Leicester Square? And I just felt it was right. I felt that if we're going to go down, let's go down in the Zeppelin. The fact that we outgrossed Gandhi at the Odeon Leicester Square and we outgrossed Splash, and it was a huge success there, vindicates us. But it doesn't vindicate us in a positive way, because I'm not quite sure why we did it. I'm not quite sure why we took such a crazy step. It wasn't like, oh, the first step is we're going to make Company of Wolves, and then the next step is we make Absolute Beginners.
One of the ideas of Absolute Beginners when it started off was that it should be a kind of combination of Mean Streets with Pennies from Heaven, that it should be a kind of strange, surreal, violent, crazed piece of cinematic energy.
Julien was an old friend, actually from the Sex Pistols days when he was shooting Rock and Roll Swindle.
I met Steve Woolley at a Sex Pistols gig at the Screen on the Green in Islington, where he, at the time, was an usher. He was very involved in the punk attitude and incredibly passionate about cinema.
Temple had found it impossible to get Absolute Beginners financed, but 1985 was British Film Year, and with Woolley as producer, Virgin and Goldcrest came on board. It seemed an unlikely marriage. Goldcrest, after all, had risen to success on the back of '81's Oscar winner Chariots of Fire, a far cry from Temple's post-punk spectacular.
Goldcrest and Virgin wanted a very glossy, big, colourful musical with lots of songs. They thought the idea was sexy.
The original budget for Absolute Beginners was £8 million, and we were told that the figures didn't add up and that it had to be made for £6 million.
Oh yes, we're in our 58. So what? The year of Absolute Beginners.
It was a film surrounded by a lot of pressures from the beginning, so if we could start with something that proved that these sets were wonderful and that the film was going to have a unique kind of energy, that it might clear the air a little bit.
The longest hottest summer, stirred up by ignorance and hate.
The opening scene, the long take on the Soho set, was the first day's shooting. Obviously, we'd rehearsed quite studiously on that, and we didn't have enough money for everyone to have enough extras. So we had, at the beginning, we had people dressed in one sort of look, and as the camera went one way, they all had to run around the back and get other clothes on to come in as different characters.
Julien's ambitions for the film were enormous on every scale, not just size, but his ambitions to make a British musical, to make a British drama, to make a film about the race riot of '58, to make a film that said everything that he tried to say about youth, about fashion. It was too much. It was like a year's subscription to The Face.
It was the chic, fashionable film to be associated with, and, you know, I thought it was completely a ramshackle production, completely out of control. There was a nauseating element of hipper than thou that pervaded the whole thing. And Steve and Julien, I think, were the epitome of that. I've since changed my mind about the people involved, but at the time, as a struggling, fairly jealous film director, I couldn't believe how he could direct and stay clean. You know, how could he do it in such a nice suit? And Steve, of course, was just wandering about and...
I think we can get away with this.
You know, with his ponytail waving in the wind, lording himself over it. I just thought there was an awful lot of... In many ways, it kind of represented the 80s, and a lot of what was bad about it.
Goldcrest had two other movies which were in far more trouble than we were. One, The Mission, and the other one was Revolution. And these two films, Revolution was rocketing over budget, and The Mission had problems because Roland had been sick in the jungle, and they were worried about whether they were going to finish on budget, and it was a headache. So they had two big headaches.
Our problem was we were working in an extremely inhospitable climate in Colombia, where if you didn't pay people at the end of the week, all sorts of horrible things were likely to happen to you. So there was a lot of tension. I mean, we were in Colombia demanding that our cash flow was kept too, and getting very cross at the idea that there may have been another film in another rather softer and more comfortable part of the world that was as it were, drawing funds away from us. Because Revolution was a big budgeted picture that did get itself into a certain amount of budgetary trouble.
But there were these guys, and there was Steve Woolley and Julien Temple. You know, I mean, who are you going to pick on, okay? So we were the easy targets.
All I want is a quiet life. Anything for a quiet life.
Alarmed by the rough cut, Goldcrest insisted that former editor and veteran producer Alan Marshall take control.
It was boring, it was over the top, it wasn't very good. Absolute beginners. At that point, I think when I came in was going to go, I think it was at least 50% over budget, maybe a little more, but with very little that they could do about it. I believe that the director was out of control. The cast was pretty dull. Either they were very dull or very over the top. It was totally disjointed. I don't think I was successful in honing in on the problems. I think we tried really hard, all of us, everybody tried very hard. But in the end, I think we had a lame duck, and I believe that it got more lame.
I'm sure if you've interviewed Alan that you would have seen the introspective Alan Marshall. We never saw the introspective Alan Marshall. We only saw this man who spoke like a Gatling gun and had more slang words than I'd heard in my life. And I was brought up in Chapel Street Market, so I've really heard most of them. But Alan was part kind of like amusing and part very scary.
I couldn't avoid this feeling of it was like having a kid shot or something. You know, it was a very terrible feeling that I couldn't get rid of.
But if they had lost control of the movie, Palace had not lost its gift for hype, which went into overdrive for Absolute Beginner's release.
Absolute Beginners is a vivid and colourful examination of teenagers. But more than that, it's a film whose success or failure at the box office could have a far-reaching effect on the British film industry in general and the future of Goldcrest in particular. It's quite a burden for a movie to carry around with it.
Reviewing the 50s through Absolute Beginners, the new British film musical which is the subject of tonight's South Bank show.
One of the most ambitious films ever to be made in England, Absolute Beginners, is the major British musical of the 80s. Two vast sets recreating London's Notting Hill and Soho covered acres of Shepperton Film Studios in the summer of 1985.
They started the company through buying videos and selling them and aggressively selling them, aggressively hyping them. And when they moved into production, they took the same techniques. And I think with Absolute Beginners, it turned around and bit them back. They created such a furore of anticipation that when it actually did come out, it had to be beyond Citizen Kane to live up to the amount of hype that they had made.
It did very much backfire when the film finally came out. You know, there were reviews of it before it came out. There were cartoons in the newspapers. It was a household word before anyone had seen this thing.
Patsy bloody Kensett from Mulligan, Julien bloody Temple, Bowie, Burble, loaded high, Dumbler, can't bloody get away from it.
In 1986, Goldcrest went bankrupt, and Virgin decided to withdraw from film production.
It was only through Nick's guile and his wheeling and dealing and his innate business intelligence that we were able to survive that period, because we know that could have been the end of Palace, you know, in year 2.
Luckily, Palace was already in production on another, more modest film, which would restore their confidence.
To be honest, there was the big film, Absolute Beginners. There were lots of stars, and that's the big film. And then we did this tiny little film on the streets of London, Mona Lisa.
Bit damn market, isn't it?
Shut up.
I'd wanted to make a love story for a long time, you know, and a realistic kind of story of romantic obsession. This strange way that men have of getting everything about women totally wrong.
Haven't you someone to rush to?
You know I haven't.
Everyone should have.
But you haven't.
I'm different.
How? How are you different?
I'm the girl they rush home from.
The success of Mona Lisa, which had become a huge success in America and Europe, with Bob Hoskins getting an Oscar nomination, meant that we had a very high profile suddenly in the States.
Hollywood Hotel. Just a moment, I'll connect you.
Hooray for Hollywood. That's gooey valley, hooly Hollywood.
America became a little bit of an obsession. The notion that there was a marketplace there that we could tap. And so we set up an American office to develop American projects. Our first American production, Shag, was a good film for us to cut our teeth on, a film that is very American and it would appeal and did appeal to a certain American audience. We've always had an element of sellout as part of our nature. Nobody liked us in the UK anyway. Nobody ever liked Palace. Nobody ever liked Nik and I, other than a handful of people. We got, I think, more friends grew as time progressed and as time went on. But initially, in the first few years, we were thought about as being very brash, very outspoken, very arrogant, very loud Americans.
The relative success of Shag led Palace to approach a Hollywood major with a comedy script.
We made a film called High Spirits, which we got into trouble with because it would cost about $14 million, $15 million, so they had to get some of that from America and had to enter into partnership with American producers.
Our ambition was to make a big budget Ghostobusters. Columbia Pictures developed the film with us, and we actually worked with the writer from Beetlejuice on the first draft of the script, and we were going to make a sort of Ghostbusters for Ireland. And then Neil turned the script in, and everybody at Columbia was fired. At the major studios, they changed the staff, like they changed towels in public toilets. It's like, you never know what's going on. There's always somebody new in charge. So by the time we put the script in, there was a whole new team there, and the whole new team was headed by, in fact, David Puttnam. He or somebody read it there and just said, this isn't the kind of film I want to make at Columbia, and we got it back really fast.
You're a ghost, I'm an American, it would never work out.
Read Mother Mary.
Neil had written a film for the studio with all the studio bits, all the expense of a studio picture, and we ended up making it independently, which was hell.
That film was a very unhappy experience, and that was an example, or for me it was anyway, but that was an example of a film that grew beyond the kind of scale at which they worked best. Steve wanted to make a big movie, big effects, big this, big that. And step by step by step, the movie became something else. I mean, if they had enough financing to back a film like that on their own, and to make sure the film would be made and finished correctly without interference, it would have been a better experience, you know?
No respectable ghost would live in California.
All that sunshine and all those movie stars.
They're going to give those Americans exactly what they came here for.
Serve them right.
I don't think producers ever fully understand the emotional commitment that a director has to their work, you know? And because I'm a writer as well, if something is destroyed, the shape of it is destroyed, or it's gradually kind of becomes distorted or taken out of your hands, you realize that you've no identity other than what you do, you know? And if you're being represented by something that you feel doesn't represent you, you know, or you feel you weren't allowed to finish. I mean, I physically was prevented from finishing that movie, you know?
You got that?
I don't know the lesson Steve learned. I know the lesson I learned was not to get involved with loan sharks, you know, really.
The movie belly flopped with critics and saw Neil Jordan jumping the Palace ship to direct We're No Angels in Hollywood. Palace set off in search of a more sympathetic American production partner.
We were fortunate enough to strike up a relationship with Miramax, a kind of independent distributor on a very similar wavelength to Palace as distributors. And our next 10 films were distributed by Miramax.
Those fingers in my hair, that sly come hither stare, that strips my conscience bare, it's witchcraft.
Scandal was a big film for Harvey Weinstein. He paid a lot of money for it.
And
Scandal was an obvious choice, you know, and, you know, I mean, the subject matter of sex and politics is incredibly provocative. I had early memories of Christine Keeler and John Profumo, and I thought it would be an incredible project, you know, for America. And, you know, so they had asked us, you know, to be involved in a co-production as co-executive producers.
Got you.
Christine beat John Profumo, Minister for War.
Harvey was particularly concerned that that area of the film was vivid and would be to an American audience something that they hadn't seen before out of a British film. I mean, we shot scenes that we knew would get the American censor unhappy.
As far as I remember, we were contractually obligated to bring in an X-rated film. And Steve and I were trying to make something about hypocrisy. And the Weinsteins wanted us to make a film about sex. And we were kind of obligated to keep throwing in the flesh, as it were, even though we were busily intent on trimming it down, because it wasn't really that much to do with it. But Harvey used to turn up on the set with a white plastic bag whenever we had sex scenes. He was a sex police.
I mean, don't tell Michael this, but as far as I was concerned, I was very happy that Harvey wanted more sex in it, because we had to market the movie too. here.
Bit warm.
Warm, madam?
Don't you think? Definitely a bit on the warm side.
If you say so, madam.
Oh, I do.
And Harvey used to turn up, and on the days, she'd say, "What Harvey doing in town?" We suddenly realised that was the day that we were meant to be shooting some sex scene, and he'd come in just specifically to check that we didn't chicken out in the way he thought Brits, with our reputation for sex, might well do.
When we were doing Scandal and we were discussing Joanna taking off her clothes, a very long and tortured negotiation with her lawyer as to how much of her clothes she would take off at what point. And Nik was doing this, and the guy was on the phone, we were all listening to this, and the guy saying, you know, I can give you back, you know, I can give you shoulder, but I can't give you nipple, you know. And Nik's saying, well, listen, what about sort of half nipple? You know, what about nipple from below, and so forth. And this guy's in New York, and we're all over here, and they negotiated for, you know, probably half an hour about this girl's nipples. And Nik just, you know, when he hung up the phone, I mean, that's his idea of, like, you know, how he'd like to spend his time.
Financially, Scandal did very well. It was the third biggest grossing picture, independent picture in America in its year. It made £1 million its first week in Britain, which for a British independent picture was fantastic. Made a profit, but I haven't seen any of it yet, I might point out.
Where's it gone?
Well, it's gone the same way as the rest of Palace. My money's gone south.
The company had expanded while production thrived. Palace continued to be Britain's biggest independent distributor of films and videos, having huge hits with movies such as When Harry Met Sally. The Soho editing facility needed constant and expensive new equipment and suffered when advertising business dwindled during the recession. Palace's production division was trying to break into television with pop promos and a drama serial, which was disastrously aborted. In 1989, Palace won a £13 million contract to produce a music channel for the new cable broadcaster BSB, dubbed the Power Station. They hired 80 people to run it from a specially built studio.
Everybody's here, everybody's around here doing the business. Yes, we're live on the air at the moment. You wouldn't believe it, would you? But we are.
A year later, the station was cancelled when Sky bought BSB.
The idea, obviously, was the same idea of all diverse companies at that time, when very much the management fashion was to have a number of different businesses, so that when one business went through a bad cycle, there would be other businesses to support the company as a whole.
If you don't have enough capital, then you start chasing cash-generating businesses. And for various times, various people have different ideas about what constitutes a cash-generating business. Obviously, post-production house can be a cash-generating business. A deal with B-Sky B can be a cash-generating business.
How you can do all those things, or why you would want to do all those things, I don't know. It seems to me a complete error, really, because I think they probably lost their focus. And it wasn't possible for two people, actually, to pay so much attention to all those things. And in that regard, that's why they went down the Swanee.
These companies I had nothing or very little to do with. They were kind of Nik's things that, and to be honest, although I always assumed he was handling them, he was really so far involved with the distribution company and the running of Palace that he really had very little to do with those companies. And so they just were gnawing away at the profit, and then suddenly as the recession hit, they weren't gnawing anymore, they were sucking away.
In 1990, Palace commissioned a management consultancy to advise them about business affairs.
We were going to concentrate on distribution and production and get rid of all the other companies. By the time we got those businesses into the marketplace to sell, the recession had hit, and I think that people will probably remember just how quickly this recession did hit.
Palace began to make even more movies in the hope that one would be the big success that would put them in the black. This policy worried their main financial backer.
Palace started to produce quite a large number of films in quite a short period. And I think that is always dangerous for a small company, because for independent producers, pulling a film together requires an enormous use of resources. And when you try to do too many within a short space of time, you perhaps are not able to put the resources into individual projects that you should be putting into them.
Ultimately, the production had to keep making hits. And anybody who makes film after film will tell you, you can't make a hit each time. If it was that easy, everybody would be doing it.
They were always notoriously late payers, and you lived with it and you ran with it, and they would always bargain you down to the absolute rock bottom price. But you lived with that, because any minute now there could be another huge Palace hit. And I think it was when there were 2 or 3 films in a row, you could see what was in the pipeline, and you began to lose confidence with them ever being able to make their money back. The Big Man is a good example. I just couldn't see where the market was for that.
The Big Man, the tale of an unemployed miner hired to fight in an illegal bare-knuckle grudge match between 2 rival gang lords, was a dour and expensive film for Palace to make.
The idea that we had was to make a movie which was a noir movie, a gangster movie, but which had all these political reverberations in it.
The Big Man was a film that truly bemuses me because I really thought the film was all right. Obviously, I think the film was very good because I produced it, and I probably think every film I produced is very good. Critics hated it. To a man and a woman, they hated the film. There's a very political message there as well. Maybe the message was too much. I think that's definitely pissed a lot of the critics off.
I think they tended to regard Steve and Nik as kind of cultural barra boys, trading movies off the back of a lorry in Chapel Street Market. And some of their projects, particularly The Big Man, paid highly for them. They didn't like to see a film about an unemployed miner who lives down a cul-de-sac, shot on a grand scale with an Ennio Morricone score. And as Steve Woolley rightly said, if the film had been made in Italian and had an English language subtitle, they'd have hailed it as a masterwork. Overall, the film lost Palace a lot of money, and was partially responsible, I think, for their demise.
To my dying day, I will go and say that The Big Man is a true, very, very fine film, and all credit to David and Liam and all the people who participated in it. But I could be in need, as they say, of a sanity test.
We then followed The Big Man with The Miracle, which was a film that we wanted to make with Neil after he made We're No Angels in Hollywood. It was a film that I felt was important as well for us, for me to cement my relationship with Neil again.
I just wanted to get back to making films with some level of freedom, you know, to see did I even enjoy it anymore, you know, that kind of thing. And it would have been very easy for me to continue to make movies in Hollywood.
And so we had a flop with The Miracle after The Big Man, and it was, you know, again, we didn't have any theatrical hits that year either, and we've been used to, you know, big theatrical hits.
The lack of theatrical hits was not the only worry for Palace's financiers. Cassette sales were also flagging, badly denting cash flow.
It became apparent that the video market was both contracting and changing. And I became worried at that point in time because one of Palace's principal business was video distribution, and it was their most profitable business. And I could see that the changes were going to negatively impact that business.
The majors had woken up like a slumbering giant. They'd seen that there was huge amounts to be made in video, and they had really taken over. And the big titles were making the money on video. So suddenly, the reins were being pulled in, and the more adventurous titles, the independent titles, they just weren't really being noticed.
If the rest of the film industry were the regular army, we were the guerrillas. I certainly was surprised how long we did survive. It was like looking over the cliff many times, and somehow we'd always, a lot of times through Nik's tenacity and ingenuity, be pulled back from the brink. but we had to fall in the end.
We had a particularly dry year, and the other smaller companies were losing, and so we realised that we were really beginning to shake violently.
Nik and Steve were, understandably, reluctant to relinquish control over the company, which is not an unusual sentiment. I mean, most individuals who control their companies are reluctant to relinquish that control.
Yeah, I don't think we wanted to sell out to anybody. Who would? I mean, if you've got a successful business and it's going well, you want to make your business better, but you don't want to sell it. The whole point of running Palace, you know, and it's not like I'm not trying to make it out I'm St. Stephen Woolley of the King's Cross. I mean, I'm no saint. I wanted us to have a big, successful company. You know, and the reason I didn't take fees from films is because I felt that our company was worth something, and that all the money we made from films was ploughed into the company to keep turning it over.
Ironically, the movie that might have saved Palace and made Stephen Woolley into the patron saint of film producers was also the first script that Palace ever commissioned. Neil Jordan returned to The Soldier's Wife, abandoned 10 years ago, and added a major twist involving its femme fatale. Even with a new title, the movie proved almost impossible to finance in Palace's fragile condition.
I had a real gun to my head on The Crying Game because Neil had almost a finished screenplay for Cannes. I tried to get money from Miramax, from Sony, from other distributors in America. I just assumed that they would read the script and love it. They didn't love it at all.
Everybody says you'll never make this. It's about terrorism, it's about the IRA, it's about homosexuality, it's about cross-dressing, it's about race, you know. How dare you? Are you being provocative? Are you trying to offend us?
So then we were going through the summer, and we still didn't have any money for the film, and Neil was saying, you said that we'd make it in the summer, and I said, well, I thought we could get the money, but it doesn't look as if it's that easy. And he was like, well, it's the summer film. I've written it for the summer. I've got cricket scenes. I've got this. I've got sunlight. You know, how can you not, you know, let me down? And I was, well, Neil, I'm sorry. You know, I don't think we're going to get the money for it now. And he said, I'm going to go off and make a Hollywood picture.
A very low budget was eventually scraped together from Channel 4, British Screen, a consortium of European backers and Japanese distributors. No Americans invested in the film.
It was very interesting making this movie and having all the cast and crew deferring their fees, and Stephen basically having to grab the money out of the cinema that he runs, you know, to pay the wages on Friday. For everybody involved, it seemed to me to be a kind of moral commitment to the movie because of the kind of movie it was.
You go straight to kiss it, don't you, Forrest? Yeah?
Never piss holding the girl's hand, Jude.
You didn't?
You know what?
Tell me, Judy.
It's nice.
Not here.
It was a very tough film to make. Neil was particularly tough on me and on the crew because he had so little money. He had to get everything. He had to get it there, and so he had to be tough. Although we had the contract signed, we didn't have any cash, and so I was borrowing money from the box office here, from my own credit card, from all sorts of sources. Palace was going down, so there was no money in our bank accounts to forward to make up the gap.
The last Friday of the last week or something, standing out here and having a drink here. And Steve was saying, you know, how they're taking the computers away, and Nik's on the phone, as he always is, you know, making some sort of last-minute deal, you know, and as in the middle of the conversation, the phone account was cut off, you know, and he immediately put the phone down, dug into another pocket, got another phone out, got the guy back, resumed the conversation. During that conversation, that phone was cut off, as all their accounts were closing. He went into Steve's bag, got yet another phone, went back, did it again, and they were roaring with laughter. I mean, the whole thing was you know, just so crazy, and in a sense, what this making films is about is thriving on crisis, and this was like a pretty big crisis.
The crisis came to a head in April 1992 when the Dutch multimedia giant Polygram, which had been negotiating to buy into Palace, pulled out after 5 months. It had considered adding Palace to its roster of specialist film companies. But after auditing the books and examining the film library and future plans, Hologram decided that Palace's debts outweighed its assets.
In '92, we had acquired Reservoir Dogs, Howard's End, and The Player, and of course our own film, The Crying Game, and would have probably had the most successful year that we'd ever have had in our history of 10, 11 years. And so we were cut short from that moment basically because people lost their nerve. Nobody would believe that we could come back from the dead. People felt that we were dead and gone because we'd had a bad year.
By that time, the financial problems were so huge, and the nature of what they'd had to give away in order to survive up to then had been so large that the chances of even big hits pulling them out of their problems, I think, was remote.
For reasons which I'm still not clear about, I did not, as I always do in all the other transactions of business, I did not develop until a very late stage a competing offer.
We wondered whether or not we should, take a risk and come in with him on it. Nik's my oldest friend said, it was awful to, see it not working out. But the airline business is sort of rough and tough enough as it is, without, maybe getting involved in another business which is equally perilous.
In May '92, Palace went into administration with more than £18 million of debts.
There was a very delayed reaction for me because I didn't, as usual, admit defeat until that administration had completed its work and not saved the company. And then it went into official receivership, and I felt sick.
How do you feel now?
I still feel sick about it. I don't, I'm not angry with other people. I'm angry with myself for not having succeeded. No one likes failure. No one likes to see as many people hurt as were hurt. And no one likes to be responsible for the considerable pain that was caused to a large number of individuals and corporations during that process, and to have been so close to none of that happening.
They went down owing us about £100,000. We employ 18 people. We had to let some people go, and we very nearly closed.
The fact that a few people have had their fingers burnt, there are some creditors out there, is a sad fact, and I feel, I take my share of guilt for that, but I'm really not going to tie a cross on my back and carry it up a mountain.
There was a lot of ill feeling amongst the British film community when Palace went down, leaving so many unpaid bills.
I was staggered by the sort of vicious level of anger about Palace going down. While we were in Cannes, Nik had a black eye, and everyone was going, "Oh, he's been beaten up," and they were quite gleeful about it. And the main thing I can put it down to, people's anger at Palace, is that they wanted to be Palace. That Palace were the spivs and the cowboys who actually pulled it off.
Palace failing is a failure for all of us in cinema. It's not their tragedy, it's all of our tragedies, because it actually, once again, reminds the city or the people that might finance our films that it's a very dubious and difficult business. So I think a lot of people actually were rubbing their hands with pleasure because, I don't know, it's a particularly perverse British thing that we actually get so much pleasure out of other people's failure, really.
One day soon I'm gonna tell the moon about the crying game.
The Crying Game coincided with the demise of Palace. Finally, they collapsed, they went under. England was the first place it was released, The release in Britain almost killed the film. Stone dead. It's like wading or rowing through glue, really, trying to actually even get kind of magazine coverage on a movie,
Don't want no more.
The Crying Game was made as Palace was in deep shit and they were struggling to finish it. And they sold it to Miramax. And Harvey Weinstein bought it off them cheaply. I don't know what it was, but it was certainly cheaply, in order for them to have enough money to finish the picture.
The minute we saw The Crying Game, in a rough cut stage, we, just said, this is a truly phenomenal film. My brother Bob, saw it in London and just called me and said, this is one of the greatest movies I've ever seen. I screened it with 20 people in my organization who hadn't read the screenplay, and at the critical moment, there were 20 gasps.
No way. You said anything, Dale. Girl has to draw the line somewhere.
I remember at the very, very first screening of the film in Telluride at the film festival there, Stephen Woolley got up and said, "No, please don't give away the ending." And I thought he was saying that just for the benefit of critics, but in fact that became the marketing campaign for the film.
The marketing campaign was orchestrated to such an extent that it became this huge secret that you were either part of or you weren't part of. And nobody wanted to not be part of it, and nobody would tell them what was going on.
Then, of course, it's gone and made Christ knows what, 60 million or something. And Harvey, who obviously should have taken them out to lunch and given them $2 million in a brown paper bag, gave them a book. I don't know what book, but there's no book that is good enough.
Who's got the Crying Game's money? Where is it? Come on, own up, Harvey. Where's the money? I think that having been in distribution and knowing the brutal truth of how the food chain goes, there's this long-held journalist-fed fantasy that if a movie takes X amount of dollars, $65 million as The Crying Game has in the US, that means the production company, the entity that raised, or rather the financiers, will see $65 million. It's absolute nonsense.
The truth is that exhibitors make money and distributors make money, and they have no contact with filmmaking whatsoever. They're the slime on the bottom of my shoe, and they should be shot. And they know who they are as well. Steve used to be one.
The perception of the movie is that it's made a fortune, you know what I mean? But none of the participants will ever make a fortune out of it now, because we've had to sell off. I mean, all the deferral has been paid back. The profit, there will be a certain amount of profit participation, but it'll be nothing like what it should be. And I think really because we were so weak, we were in such a weak kind of bargaining position when we came to make the movie.
If the financial gains were poor, the prestige was high. The Crying Game proved a dark horse at the Oscars with 5 nominations, and Neil Jordan won Best Original Screenplay. Overnight, Palace producers went from being bankrupt failures to Flavor of the Month in Los Angeles.
Steve is now known in Hollywood as the producer of the Crying Game, and it opens doors, and it brings with it a cachet that you can't buy. You can't buy it. It's like lightning strikes, and you have a window of opportunity to take advantage of it, and that's what he's doing at the moment, which is great.
After Palace went bust, one of the first things that happened was Steve came and asked us to design the logo for Scala Films, and we did it, and we still did it, which I think says more about the madness of film people than anything else.
Palace is no more, but as Scala Productions, the company has several films in preparation. First to open will be Backbeat, the story of John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe, the fifth Beatle.
Stand by. Roll camera.
Terence Davis will be directing The Neon Bible in the spring, while both Michael Caton-Jones and Julien Temple are directing features for Scala later in the year. Meanwhile, Steve Woolley is producing Neil Jordan's next film, Interview with a Vampire, starring Tom Cruise for Warner Brothers. Once again, the American film industry will reap the rewards of UK film talent, as they did on The Crying Game.
There's a view, perhaps it's endemic to Britain, that you can make money without spending it. You can make money without investing. The Hollywood studios have made massive investments, which is why they have such a large part of the world market. One has to, in business, to invest in order to to continue to reap rewards.
You have to take a 10-movie view or a 5-year view, and it's, you know, but then anyone watching this program would say the same has been the sad story of British industry generally, not just the film industry. We have no capacity to take a long view. We constantly seem to do things in an undercapitalized manner, and the nature of our investment seems to be that the plug gets pulled at the least opportune moment.
You know, we did lots of things that were very risky and that paid off, giving a lot of companies around us confidence, a lot of filmmakers confidence. I think we had a commitment to British cinema that I really hope somebody else takes up.
Money don't get everything, it's true. But what it don't get, I can't use. I need more. That's what I want. That's what I want. What I want. That's what I want. What I want. That's what I want. That's what I want. Give me money. What I want. What I want. Give me money. What I want. Lots of money. That's what I want. That's what I want.
Thank you very much indeed.
Backbeat opens here in April, and you can see Company of Wolves later tonight on BBC Two. And here's a sweet coda. A few weeks ago, Steve Woolley and Nik Powell were handed a Special Achievement Felix at the European Film Awards. Moving Pictures will be back on January 16th in a regular Sunday night slot. Coming attractions include Spielberg and Coppola on John Milius, the movie brat who got away, and Martin Scorsese on The Age of Innocence. We fly to Mali with Africa's premier director Souleymane Cissé and visit a film set in Macedonia with an earshot of gunfire on the Serbian border. We take an uplifting look at the crane shot and dig the dirt on the love-hate affair between Hollywood and the press. We'll be hearing from Jeff Bridges on surviving a plane crash in Peter Weir's Fearless and taking tips from a fearless band of British low-budgeteers on how to survive, period. But the series starts where no other film show dares to tread, on the set of Pulp Fiction, Quentin Tarantino's follow-up to Reservoir Dogs. Good night. See you in the new year. You're gonna love this series.